Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku had a quirk that evolved based on who he lost. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world began, as it so often did, with the smell of sizzling pork and the gentle hum of a happy home. Izuku Midoriya sat at the small kitchen table, though it worn smooth by years of hurried breakfasts and lingering dinners. His pen scratched furiously across the pages of Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13, the ink barely keeping pace with the torrent of thoughts in his head. Sunlight, thick and golden, streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like miniature, glittering galaxies. It was a perfect, ordinary morning, the kind of morning you store away in your memory without realizing its value until it's gone forever. Izuku, you'll burn holes in that paper if you write any harder, a soft voice teased. He looked up, a sheepish grin spreading across his freckled face. Inko Midoriya stood at the stove, her posture a familiar, comforting slump. She wielded a pair of chopsticks with practiced ease, turning a piece of katsudon in the sizzling pan. Her green hair, a shade darker than his own untamable mop, was tied back loosely. She wasn't a hero, a celebrity, or anyone of public note. She was just a mom. To Izuku, that meant she was the foundation upon which his entire world was built. Sorry, Mom, he mumbled, capping his pen. It's just. Kamui Woods debuted a new move yesterday, the lacquer chain prison, and I have to break down its applications against villains with high mobility. But then you have to consider its weakness against wide-area elemental quirks like. Inko smiled, a gentle, knowing expression that could calm the most turbulent of his anxieties. I know, sweetie. Just remember to breathe. And to eat. She plated the katsudon, the crispy, golden brown cutlet resting on a fluffy bed of rice and egg. The aroma alone was enough to make his stomach rumble in appreciation. As she set the bowl before him, she reached for the soy sauce on the counter. Her brow furrowed in concentration for a second, and the small bottle wobbled before sliding a few inches across the countertop, just close enough for her to grab without stretching. It was her quirk. A minor, almost insignificant brand of telekinesis, officially registered as small object attraction. She could pull things toward herself, but only if they were lightweight and within a few feet. She used it for finding the remote, grabbing a fallen sock, or, most often, pulling ingredients closer while cooking. It was a quiet, domestic power, a perfect reflection of the woman who wielded it. Izuku had spent 14 years hoping, praying, for a version of it to manifest in him. Or his father's fire breath. Or anything at all. Thanks for breakfast, Izuku said, his voice slightly muffled as he eagerly shoveled a mouthful of rice and pork. It's the best. It's fuel for that big brain of yours, she said, sitting opposite him with a cup of green tea. Her eyes, large and full of a perpetual, gentle worry, scanned his face. You were up late again, weren't you? I saw the light under your door. Izuku froze mid-chew. Just studying. Studying heroes, she corrected softly, not with accusation, but with a deep, maternal understanding that was almost worse. Izuku, we've talked about this. It's wonderful to have dreams, but you also have to be realistic. There it was. The word. Realistic. The gentlest knife she owned, wielded only to protect him from the much sharper blades of the outside world. He knew she was right. A quirkless boy in a world defined by power had as much chance of becoming a pro-hero as a fish had of climbing a tree. But the dream was a fire in his chest, a roaring inferno kindled by a decade of watching All Might save people with a fearless smile. I know, he said, looking down at his bowl. The delicious breakfast suddenly felt heavy in his stomach. But All Might always says that anyone can be a hero if they have the spirit. It's not just about the power, it's about the will to save people. Inko sighed, a soft, gusty sound. She reached across the table, her small hand covering his. And you have more spirit than anyone I've ever known, my sweet Izuku. That's what makes me so proud. And so worried. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise that he would be careful. A promise he was already destined to break. The walk to Aldera Junior High was a familiar gauntlet. The cracks in the pavement were a map of his hometown, each one a landmark. He clutched his notebook to his chest like a shield, his mind still buzzing with hero statistics and tactical analyses. It was his armor against the jeers and the pitying looks. He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear them approach until their shadows fell over him. Well, if it isn't the useless Deku. Izuku's blood ran cold. He looked up into the crimson, arrogant eyes of Katsuki Bakugo. Flanked by his two cronies, Bakugo looked less like a fellow student and more like a predator who had cornered his favorite prey. Keikaken, Izuku stammered, taking an involuntary step back. Still scribbling in that creepy notebook? One of the lackeys sneered, gesturing with his chin. What's the point? You gonna bore a villain to death? Bakugo snatched the notebook from Izuku's grasp before he could react. The cover, lovingly labeled by Izuku's own hand, was now held in a grip that promised only destruction. Hero analysis for the future? Bakugo read aloud, his voice dripping with contempt. He let out a short, derisive laugh. Are you serious? You're quirkless. You're below the rejects. You think you can stand in the same ring as me? Give it back, Kaken, Izuku pleaded, his hands trembling. It's important. Crackle. Pop. Bakugo slammed his palms together, and the notebook was instantly engulfed in a small, contained explosion. The force of it blackened the cover and singed the edges of the pages. A wisp of acrid smoke curled into the air. Izuku stared, his heart sinking as if the explosion had gone off in his own chest. All those hours of work, all that passion, reduced to a charred, smoking ruin. Without a second thought, Bakugo tossed the smoldering book over his shoulder, and it landed with a soft plop in the koi pond behind him. The fish scattered. If you want to be a hero so bad, I've got a time-saving idea for you, Bakugo said, his voice chillingly casual as he turned to leave. He paused, looking back over his shoulder with a cruel smirk. Take a swan dive off the roof and pray you'll be born with a quirk in your next life. The words hit Izuku with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed out of his lungs. Bakugo and his friends walked away, laughing, leaving Izuku standing alone, shaking, with the echo of their cruelty ringing in his ears. For a moment, a dark, ugly thought slithered through his mind. What if he did it? What if he just ended it? He violently shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. No. He couldn't. His mom, the thought of what it would do to her was a physical pain. He was her whole world, just as she was his. His despair was interrupted by a booming voice that seemed to shake the very ground. I am here! Izuku spun around, his jaw dropping. There, in all his muscle-bound, primary-colored glory, was All Might. But something was wrong. He looked deflated. Skinny. Almost skeletal. He clutched a plastic soda bottle that seemed to contain a murky, swirling green substance. Before Izuku could process the bizarre sight, the hero coughed, and in a puff of smoke, he transformed back into the towering symbol of peace. The subsequent conversation was a blur of frantic fanboying and shocking revelations. All Might's injury, his time limit, the truth behind his unflinching smile. It was a deluge of information that systematically dismantled Izuku's pristine image of his idol. And yet, through it all, a single, desperate question clawed its way up his throat. He had to ask. He had to know. Even without a quirk, Izuku began, his voice trembling as he looked up at the gaunt figure of his hero. Can I still be a hero? Can someone like me ever hope to be like you? All Might was silent for a long moment. He looked at the frail, tear-streaked boy before him, a boy with so much heart and not an ounce of power to back it up. The hero's face, etched with pain and exhaustion, softened with a sad pity. Kid, he said, his voice heavy with a kindness that felt like a death sentence. It's good to have dreams. But you have to be realistic. Realistic. The same word his mother used. The same gentle knife. Coming from his hero, it didn't just cut, it eviscerated. Pro-heroes are always risking their lives, All Might continued, unaware of the devastation he was causing. Some villains can't be beaten without raw power. I can't just tell you that you can be a hero without a quirk. It's a dangerous job, and without power, you'd be a liability. You could get hurt. Or worse. He placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder. If you want to help people, you could become a police officer. They get a bad rap because they don't get to parade their quirks around, but it's a fine profession. He turned and walked toward the stairs, leaving Izuku standing there, the hero's words echoing in the empty space where his dream used to be. It was gone, snuffed out not by a bully's cruelty, but by a hero's pragmatism. Izuku walked home in a daze. The world seemed muted, the colors leached out, the sounds muffled. He didn't even bother to retrieve his notebook from the koi pond. What was the point? It was all just a childish fantasy. Kaken was right. All Might was right. His mom was right. He was useless. A Deku. Then he heard the explosions. He snapped out of his stupor. A crowd was gathered at the mouth of a narrow shopping alley. Smoke billowed into the sky. It was the same sound as Kaken's quirk, but louder, more frantic. More desperate. Izuku pushed his way through the crowd, his heart beginning to pound with a sick, dawning horror. There, in the center of the chaos, was the sludge villain. The same one All Might had captured. It must have escaped when Izuku had clung to his leg. This is my fault, the thought screamed in his head, and then he saw who the villain had captured. Spiky blonde hair. Red, terrified eyes. It was Bakugo. He was suffocating, clawing at the viscous green ooze that was forcing its way down his throat, setting off explosions in a desperate, futile attempt to break free. The pro-heroes were there, Death Arms, Kamui Woods, Backdraft, but they were helpless. The alley was too narrow for Death Arms to get a good angle. The fire from Bakugo's explosions made it impossible for Kamui Woods to get close. They were waiting for someone with the right quirk. Izuku stood frozen, a spectator to his own failure. It was his fault the villain was here. It was his fault Kaken was dying, and as he looked at Bakugo's terrified eyes, the eyes of a boy who had tormented him for a decade, he didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't feel anger. He felt a desperate, overwhelming urge to help. He saw something else then, on the edge of the crowd. A flash of familiar green hair. A small, frantic figure pushing through people, a grocery bag clutched in her hand. Mom? His blood turned to ice. Inko Midoriya, her face a mask of pure terror, had obviously been shopping nearby when the commotion started. She was looking around wildly, her eyes scanning the crowd. He knew who she was looking for. She was looking for him. Her eyes met his for a split second across the sea of people. Relief washed over her face, quickly replaced by sheer panic as she saw the danger so close. Izuku! Her voice was a thin, reedy scream, lost in the roar of the explosions. All Might's words from earlier echoed in his head. My legs, they just started moving on their own. Before he could think, before he could process the danger or his own powerlessness, Izuku was running. He burst through the police barricade, a pathetic, quirkless boy charging toward a monster that had cowed a team of pros. Kid! No! Death Arms yelled. He didn't listen. He wasn't thinking about being a hero. He was just thinking about the look in Bakugo's eyes. He unslung his backpack, the only weapon he had, and hurled it at the villain. A lucky textbook struck the villain directly in the eye, causing it to flinch for a precious second. Kaken! Izuku screamed, clawing at the sludge, trying to get a purchase, trying to pull his tormentor free. His fingers sank into the foul-smelling ooze, finding nothing solid to grip. What the hell are you doing, Deku? Bakugo choked out, his voice hoarse. Why are you here? I don't know. Izuku cried, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the grime and sweat. My legs, they just moved. You looked like you were asking for help. For a single, fleeting moment, the arrogance in Bakugo's eyes was replaced by something else. Shock. Disbelief. The villain recovered, its massive form surging. You again! I'll kill you both! It roared, a slimy tendril lashing out, aimed directly at Izuku's head. This was it. This was how he died. A stupid, quirkless kid who got in the way. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the blow never came. Instead, there was a deafening groan of tortured metal from above. One of Bakugo's desperate, uncontrolled explosions had struck the support pillar of a pedestrian overpass that ran above the alley. The structure, already old and poorly maintained, had been fatally weakened. Time seemed to stretch, to warp into an agonizingly slow crawl. Izuku's eyes snapped open. He saw it all with a horrifying, crystalline clarity. Cracks spiderwebbed across the concrete. Dust and pebbles rained down. He saw the pro-heroes' faces turn from frustration to horror. He saw Bakugo's eyes widen, and he saw his mother. She was no longer on the edge of the crowd. In her panic, seeing him run into danger, she had pushed forward, trying to get to him, to pull him back. She was standing almost directly under the failing structure. Her face was tilted upwards, her eyes wide with a dawning, final terror. The forgotten grocery bag had slipped from her fingers, apples and onions rolling across the pavement. M.O.M. The word was a raw, primal scream torn from the deepest parts of his soul. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. The world answered with a roar. The overpass didn't just crack, it shattered. A multi-ton slab of concrete and twisted rebar broke free and plummeted downwards. It moved with an impossible, sickening speed, a grey harbinger of death. It wasn't aimed at him, or the villain, or the heroes. It was aimed right where she stood. She didn't even have time to scream. There was just a thunderous, final crunch of impact, a sound that obliterated everything else. A massive cloud of grey dust erupted, obscuring the scene in an impenetrable shroud. Silence, a profound, absolute silence descended, more deafening than the collapse itself. The explosion stopped. The shouting stopped. For Izuku, his own breathing stopped. His heart stopped. The world stopped. He was on his knees, though he didn't remember falling. His gaze was fixed on the mountain of rubble, the plume of dust that was slowly, lazily beginning to settle. A single, bright red apple had rolled to a stop just inches from his shoe. Nothing. There was nothing. No movement. No sound. She was gone. The thought was so immense, so impossible, that his mind simply refused to process it. It was like trying to comprehend the size of the universe. It was a truth too large to fit inside him. Mom, who made him Katsudon? Who worried about him? Who could pull the remote closer with a little furrow of her brow? Gone. Under the rubble. Because he ran. Because he tried to be a hero. The sludge villain, forgotten for a moment, began to reform. It chuckled, a wet, gurgling sound. Well, that's one less distraction. Now, to finish you off, you little pest. It lunged, but Izuku didn't see it. He wasn't in the alley anymore. He was in a void. A vast, empty space filled with a single, overwhelming feeling. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was a cavernous, soul-shattering absence. It was the feeling of a fundamental piece of his own being getting violently ripped out, leaving a raw, bleeding wound behind. And into that wound, something new flooded in. A white-hot energy coursed through him, a power that felt ancient and utterly alien. It felt like grief itself had taken on a physical form inside his veins. Something inside his head, a lock he never knew existed, snapped. The world came rushing back, but it was different now. He could feel it. He could feel the ground beneath his knees, not just its texture, but its weight, its very essence. He could feel the jagged edges of the rubble, the smooth surface of the fallen apple, the sharp corners of the textbook lying a few feet away. It was as if invisible threads now connected him to everything, threads woven from his own shattering sorrow. The villain's slimy fist was inches from his face. Izuku didn't flinch. He didn't even breathe. He just pushed, not with his hands. Not with his body. He pushed with the gaping hole in his soul. Whump. An invisible wall of force slammed into the sludge villain. It wasn't an explosion. It was a pure, kinetic shove, silent and immense. The villain was hurled backward, its semi-liquid form splattering against the far wall of the alley with a wet smack. It slid to the ground, dazed and disoriented. Izuku remained on his knees, his head bowed. A small pebble at his feet lifted into the air, wobbling. Then another. Then the red apple. The charred remains of Bakugo's notebook floated up from where it had been dropped. Soon, a dozen small objects were suspended in the air around him, orbiting his grief-stricken form in a silent, sorrowful ballet. Fear not! For I am here! All Might finally arrived, his voice a thunderclap that broke the spell. He took in the scene in a fraction of a second, the stunned heroes, the dazed villain, the terrified Bakugo finally gasping for air, and the small, shaking boy on his knees, surrounded by floating debris. Detroit smash! With a single, mighty punch, All Might blasted the sludge villain into 1,000 harmless droplets. The force of the blow changed the air pressure, and clouds overhead began to swirl. Rain began to fall. The crisis was over. The villain was defeated. A boy was saved. A hero had triumphed. But All Might wasn't smiling. His gaze was fixed on Izuku. He saw the catatonic shock on the boy's face. He saw the floating objects, and he saw the mountain of freshly fallen rubble that paramedics were now frantically swarming, their faces grim. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was looking at a tragedy far greater than a simple villain attack. The hours that followed were a merciless, muted fog, the flashing lights of ambulances and police cars, the gentle but firm hands of a paramedic guiding him away, the scratchy wool of a blanket draped over his shoulders, the questions from a police officer, to which he could only mumble nonsensical answers. He vaguely registered someone telling him that Bakugo was okay. He felt nothing. He vaguely registered All Might, in his skinny form, talking to the police in low, urgent tones, gesturing toward him. His hero looked haunted. Eventually, Toshinori Yagi himself drove him home. The ride was silent. The rain streaked down the windows, blurring the city lights into a watercolor mess of bleeding colors. What could the man say? I'm sorry your mother died because a villain I let escape caused the chaos that led to her death? I'm sorry my words of discouragement led you to a state of such despair that you ran into that chaos. There were no words. There was only the quiet hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers, counting out the seconds of Izuku's new, empty life. He unlocked the door to his apartment. The air inside was still and heavy. It still smelled faintly of katsudan. I'll be back in the morning to check on you, young Midoriya, Toshinori said, his voice strained. We'll figure things out. Social services. I'll handle it. Izuku just nodded, not really hearing. He stepped inside and closed the door, shutting out the hero, the rain, and the world. He was alone. The silence was a living thing. It was a crushing weight, pressing in on him from all sides. Every familiar object in the small apartment was now a monument to a life that had just ended. The worn spot on the sofa where she sat to watch her dramas. The stack of coupons on the counter. The slightly crooked photo frame on the wall, holding a picture of a younger him on her shoulders, both of them beaming. His legs carried him to his room, a shrine to All Might that now felt like a cruel joke. Figurines and posters of the smiling hero surrounded him. The symbol of peace. The man who saved everyone. He couldn't save her. He sank to the floor, his body finally giving out. He was hollow. A shell. He had cried so much earlier that he had no tears left. There was only a cold, vast emptiness. His eyes fell on a small, limited edition All Might figurine on his desk, the Silver Age version. His mother had waited in line for 3 hours to get it for his last birthday. He remembered her excitement when she gave it to him, her pride in finding the one thing he wanted most. He reached out for it, his hand trembling, wanting to feel the smooth, cool plastic, to hold on to one last tangible piece of her love. His fingers were still an inch away when the figurine lifted off the desk. It floated in the air before him, bobbing gently, held aloft by an invisible force. Izuku stared, his breath catching in his throat, and then he remembered. The soy sauce bottle. The remote control. The little furrow of her brow. Small object attraction. He looked at his own hand, then back at the floating figurine. He focused, and the figurine drifted slowly to the left. He thought of pulling it closer, and it shot into his waiting palm. The plastic was solid and real. The power was real. A sound, half sob, half laugh, escaped his lips. It was a horrifying, broken noise. He got it. After 14 years of desperate, hopeless wishing, he finally had a quirk. It wasn't his father's. It was hers. A stronger, more versatile version, but it was undeniably, unmistakably hers. The realization crashed down on him with the force of the collapsing overpass. The cost. The trigger. His quirk wasn't a gift he was born with. It was a legacy he had just inherited. A power forged in the crucible of his own personal apocalypse. He clutched the figurine to his chest, his body finally racked with a new wave of sobs, each one a dry, agonizing heave. He had gotten everything he had ever wanted, And the price was the one thing he could never live without. The world outside was loud with sirens and rain. But inside the apartment, and inside Izuku Midoriya's heart, there was only a profound and unending silence. The silence in the apartment had a texture. It was thick and suffocating, clinging to the furniture and filling the spaces where laughter used to be. For 3 days, Izuku had moved through it like a diver in the deep ocean, the pressure immense and crushing. He ate when food was placed before him, slept when exhaustion finally claimed him, and stared at walls that seemed to ripple with memories. The world had gone from vibrant technicolor to a washed-out, grainy black and white. His new guardian was a ghost of a man. Toshinori Yagi, stripped of his heroic persona, was all sharp angles and hollowed-out cheeks, a walking monument to regret. He was hopelessly, painfully awkward. He would try to cook, only to burn the rice and oversalt the miso soup. He would try to make conversation, his voice a low rumble that felt like an intrusion in the sanctified quiet, asking questions Izuku had no energy to answer. "Do you need anything, my boy? Are you feeling all right?" The questions were pointless. What he needed was his mother. What he felt was a void. On the 4th day, Toshinori placed a simple black suit on the end of Izuku's bed. It was clean, pressed, and felt as alien as a spacesuit. It's time, young Midoriya," he said, his voice softer than usual, laced with a dread that mirrored Izuku's own. The funeral was a blur of muted colors and muffled sounds. The sky was a merciless, indifferent blue. He stood before a closed casket, a decision made by the authorities and one for which he was grimly grateful. He didn't want his last image of her to be that. He wanted to remember the warmth of her smile, the smell of her cooking, the gentle frow of her brow when she used her quirk. The polished wood of the coffin reflected the faces of strangers and neighbors, their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Mitsuki Bakugo, Katsuki's mother, pulled him into a fierce, suffocating hug. She smelled of glycerin and burnt sugar, a scent from Katsuki's quirk that always clung to their home. "Izuku," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am so sorry. She was a wonderful woman. If you need anything at all, you call us. You hear me?" He gave a numb nod. He could feel Katsuki's eyes on him from a distance. For once, they held no anger, no arrogance. They held a raw, confused shock, as if he was seeing Izuku for the first time not as Deku, but as a person to whom something truly terrible had happened. The sight offered no comfort. After the service, in a sterile, gray office that smelled of stale coffee and paperwork, the reality of his new life was laid out in bureaucratic terms. A woman from Child Welfare Services, Ms. Tanaka, spoke in a monotone that scraped against his raw nerves. She talked about foster care, group homes, and relatives he hadn't seen in a decade. Toshinori, sitting beside him, cleared his throat. "That won't be necessary," he said. His voice was quiet but held an unmistakable authority. "I will be taking him." Ms. Tanaka looked up from her clipboard, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Mr. Yagi, with all due respect, you are a single man with no prior experience. We have protocols." "I am a close friend of the family," Toshinori interrupted, a blatant lie that hung in the air between them. "I was there. I feel a profound sense of responsibility for the boy's well-being. I have the financial means, and I have already secured the necessary legal counsel to file for emergency guardianship." He leaned forward, and for a moment, the frail man seemed to grow, a shadow of All Might's presence filling the small room. "Inko Midoriya entrusted me with her son's future. I will not fail him." It was a masterful performance, a tapestry woven from guilt, desperation, and the subtle, unspoken thread of who he was. The symbol of peace did not make requests, he made things happen. Ms. Tanaka, faced with the sheer force of his will and the pile of paperwork his lawyers had already prepared, eventually relented. And just like that, Izuku Midoriya was an orphan in the care of his hero. The irony was a bitter pill he couldn't seem to swallow. They returned to the silent apartment. The finality of it was settling in, a layer of frost on his soul. That night, Izuku lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. He could feel it. The power. It was a low hum in the back of his mind, a warmth in his bones. It was a constant presence, a phantom limb that had once belonged to his mother. He slowly lifted his hand. He focused on the All Might figurine on his desk, the last gift she had ever given him. He felt that familiar, gentle pull in his mind, the same feeling he'd seen on his mother's face 1,000 times when she reached for the remote. But for him, it wasn't a gentle pull. It was a surge. The figurine shot across the room and slapped into his palm with a sharp thwack. The power was immense. Frightening. It was his mother's kindness magnified into a hurricane. He curled his fingers around the figurine, holding it tight, and for the first time in days he felt a single, hot tear trace a path down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure, undiluted terror. A week later, Toshinori found him in the same spot, staring at the same wall. The boy was wasting away, consumed by the silence and the grief. Toshinori knew he couldn't let this continue. He had failed the mother. He would be damned if he failed the son. Young Midoriya, he said, his voice firm. Get your tracksuit on. We're going out. Izuku didn't respond. Now, Izuku, Toshinori repeated, a hint of All Might's command bleeding through. Listlessly, Izuku obeyed. They took a train to the coast, the scenery passing by in an unremarkable smudge. They stopped at a place that looked like a scar on the face of the planet, Dagoba Municipal Beach Park. It wasn't a park. It was a landfill, a mountain range of trash, discarded appliances, broken furniture, and rusted-out cars cascaded down to the water's edge, a testament to decades of illegal dumping. The air smelled of salt, rust, and decay. What is this place? Izuku asked, his first voluntary words in over a week. This, Toshinori said, gesturing to the metallic mountain range, is your new training ground. Izuku stared at him, confused. Training? For what? For UA, Toshinori stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The name of the school was a physical jolt. UA High. His dream. The dream that All Might had personally extinguished just before the world had ended. But, you said? I can't be a hero. I was wrong, Toshinori said, his voice raw with self-loathing. I was a fool. I gave you the words of a tired, jaded man when you needed a hero. But that's not why we're here. We're here because of your quirk. Izuku flinched as if struck. It's not. I don't want it. Wanting it has nothing to do with the reality of possessing it, Toshinori countered, his gaze intense. You have a powerful, dangerous quirk, Izuku. A quirk born from tragedy. It's tied to your emotions. If you don't learn to control it, to master it, it will control you. It will fester inside you, fueled by your grief, until it becomes a danger to yourself and everyone around you. We are not here to build a hero. We are here to keep a good young man from being consumed by his own power. He picked up a rusted, dented microwave from a nearby pile. This place is a mess. It needs to be cleaned. And you need a purpose. A goal to channel this energy. For the next 10 months, you are going to clean this entire beach. You will move every piece of trash, from the smallest scrap to the heaviest wreck. You will do it using your quirk. You will push your power to its absolute limit, and in doing so, you will learn its boundaries, its nuances, its very nature. You will gain control. He looked Izuku dead in the eye. This is my atonement, my American dream plan for you. We will turn this tragedy into strength. We will turn this monument of neglect into a symbol of your hard work. Izuku looked from the endless sea of garbage to the gaunt face of the man who was now his keeper. He didn't feel inspired. He didn't feel motivated. He just felt tired. But it was something to do. It was a direction to face other than the four walls of his silent apartment. Okay, he whispered. The first day was an exercise in pure agony, and none of it was physical. Toshinori instructed him to start small. Just that refrigerator, he said, pointing to a yellowed, doorless appliance half buried in the sand. Izuku took a deep breath, the salty air stinging his lungs. He closed his eyes and reached out with his mind. He felt the familiar hum, the sensation of invisible threads connecting to the object. He pulled. The refrigerator didn't just slide out of the sand. It was ripped from the earth and sent flying through the air, tumbling end over end before crashing into a pile of tires 50 feet away with a deafening clang. Whoa! Toshinori yelped, jumping back. Control, my boy. Finesse. It's not about brute force, but it was too late. The moment he had touched the refrigerator with his power, a memory had flooded him, unbidden and sharp as glass. He was 6 years old, proudly showing his mother a drawing of All Might. She had smiled, taken the drawing, and stuck it to the refrigerator door with a bright red apple magnet. The refrigerator had been the same shade of yellowed white. "It's a masterpiece, Izuku," she'd said. "Right where everyone can see it." He stumbled back, his breath hitching. The power in his veins felt like a violation. It was her quirk, her essence, and he was using it to throw junk around. It felt like desecrating a grave. I can't," he gasped, clutching his head. "Yes, you can," Toshinori said, his voice firm but his eyes full of a pained understanding. "I know this is hard. But the memories are part of it. The grief is the source. You cannot run from it. You must face it, accept it, and command it. Don't let it be the master. You are in charge. Try again. Slower. Gentler." Gritting his teeth, Izuku tried again. He focused on a car bumper. He pulled, but this time he tried to moderate the force, to rein it in. The bumper lifted into the air, wobbling precariously. He remembered being in the car with his mom, stuck in traffic. He had been tracing the patterns on the dashboard. "Look, Mom," he'd said. "The car in front of us has a sticker of a dog." She had leaned over to see, her hair brushing his cheek, smelling of her floral shampoo. The bumper clattered to the ground. The memory was a fresh stab of pain. Every object was a landmine. A broken television reminded him of watching hero documentaries with her on rainy Sundays. A set of rusted pots and pans brought back the scent of her cooking. A child's tricycle, its front wheel bent and broken, was the most painful of all. It sent him back to a sun-drenched afternoon in the park, his own small legs pumping furiously on the pedals, his mother running behind him, her hand a steadying presence on his back until, finally, she let go. "You're doing it, Izuku. You're doing it all by yourself." He collapsed to his knees in the sand, dry sobs racking his body. "I can't," he wept. "Every time I use it I see her. I feel her. It hurts." Toshinori walked over and knelt beside him, placing a bony hand on his shoulder. He didn't offer platitudes or encouragement. He just knelt there in silence, a sentinel beside Izuku's grief, letting the wave crash over him. For weeks, this was their routine. They would arrive at dawn. Izuku would lift, pull, and stack the garbage of a forgotten generation. Toshinori would observe, offering quiet technical advice that Izuku barely heard. Every piece of debris was a fresh wound, a new memory brought to the surface. The training was a relentless, self-inflicted torture. Slowly, imperceptibly, something began to shift. The pain didn't lessen, but his relationship to it changed. He learned to exist within the storm of his memories. He learned to feel the surge of grief without letting it overwhelm him. The telekinesis became less of a wild, explosive force and more of a precise instrument. He could lift a dozen glass bottles without letting them touch, arranging them in neat rows. He could disentangle a web of rusted rebar with the delicate precision of a surgeon. His body changed, too. The constant mental exertion was physically taxing, and Toshinori's strict diet and exercise regimen began to strip away his baby fat, replacing it with lean, hard muscle. He was still small, but there was a wiry strength to him now, a resilience forged in the crucible of sorrow. One afternoon, about 5 months into the training, he was trying to move the rusted chassis of a large truck. It was the heaviest thing he had attempted yet. He stood before it, his feet planted in the sand, sweat dripping from his brow. "Focus on its center of mass, my boy," Toshinori called from a safe distance. "Don't try to lift it all at once. Tip it. Use leverage." Izuku ignored him. He didn't think in terms of physics. He thought in terms of feeling. He closed his eyes and reached out, enveloping the entire chassis in his power. He felt the immense, stubborn weight of it. It was like trying to lift a mountain. He pulled, pouring every ounce of his concentration, every fiber of his being, into the effort. He felt the familiar surge of power, but this time he pushed past the pain of the memories it brought. He pushed deeper, into the core of the grief itself, using the raw, aching void inside him as fuel. Her smile. The Katsudan. Her hand on his forehead when he was sick. her worried eyes. Her last, terrified look. Gray awa. A raw, guttural roar was torn from his throat. The truck chassis groaned, metal screeching against metal. It lifted. An inch. Then a foot. Then 10 feet into the air. It hovered there, trembling under the immense strain of his will. He could feel the power thrumming through him, a roaring river of energy. It was exhilarating. It was terrifying. And then he thought, what if it happens again? The question came out of nowhere, cold and sharp. What if I get close to someone else? What if I make friends at UA? Uraraka? Ida? What if a villain attacks? What if I fail to save them? The image flashed in his mind, vivid and unwelcome, one of his future classmates, lying broken. And him, standing over them, a new, terrible power crackling in his hands. A power born from their death, a legacy built on another tombstone. The horror of the thought shattered his concentration. The connection snapped. The truck chassis, weighing several tons, plummeted from the sky. Izuku! Toshinori screamed, his body instantly puffing up into his all-might form, a desperate, instinctive act. But Izuku was faster. He didn't run. He reacted. He threw his hands out, not at the truck, but at the sand beneath it. With a final, desperate scream, he telekinetically blasted a massive crater in the beach. The chassis fell into the hole with a cataclysmic crash that shook the ground, sand and debris flying everywhere. It was buried, safely out of harm's way. Izuku collapsed, his nose bleeding from the psychic strain, his body trembling uncontrollably. All might deflated back into Toshinori, rushing to his side. Are you all right, my boy? Are you hurt? He asked, his voice shaking with fear. Izuku just lay there on the sand, panting, staring at the gray sky. The sun was beginning to set, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple. For the first time, he saw the path ahead not as a vague aspiration, but as a terrifying, branching road. It could happen again, he whispered, his voice hoarse. What could? Toshinori asked, confused. Izuku turned his head, his green eyes, no longer childish and wide but old and haunted, locking onto Toshinori's. My quirk. The trigger. It was the grief. It was losing her. What if I lose someone else? The blood drained from Toshinori's face. The full, monstrous implication of Izuku's power finally crashed down on him. He had been so focused on helping the boy control the power he hadn't considered how he might get more. A quirk that evolved through loss. A power that grew with every fresh grave. It was a curse of unimaginable proportions. It was a dark mirror of his own nemesis, all for one, who stole quirks. Izuku's quirk didn't steal. It created. But the price was the same, someone else's everything. My God, Toshinori breathed, sitting back on his heels. He looked at the boy, this kind, empathetic, gentle boy, and saw the potential for a monster forged by tragedy. He saw a future where Izuku could become the strongest hero on Earth, but would be too broken and alone to be human. Izuku pushed himself into a sitting position. The setting sun cast his small frame in a long, dramatic shadow. His expression was no longer one of despair. It had hardened into something else. Something grim, resolute. My dream was to be a hero like you, Izuku said, his voice quiet but clear, carrying across the now silent beach. To save people with a smile. To be a symbol of peace. He shook his head slowly. That was a child's dream. I see that now. He looked at his own hands, calloused from the training. This power, my mother's legacy, it's not a gift. It's a warning. It's a tombstone I have to carry with me every single day, and I will not add another one to the collection. I can't. He stood up, brushing the sand from his clothes. He looked out at the ocean, at the vast, endless horizon. I still have to be a hero, he declared. I have to get into UA. I have to become stronger. But my reason has changed. He turned back to Toshinori, and the fire in his eyes was no longer the bright, innocent flame of a famba. It was the cold, hard fire of a zealot on a holy mission. I will become a hero so strong, so fast, so smart, that no one ever has to die for me again. I will become so powerful that I can protect everyone I care about. I will master this one legacy, my mother's legacy, and I will make it enough. I will become the ultimate shield. His voice dropped to a near whisper, a vow made to the universe itself. My new goal is to make sure my quirk never, ever has to activate again. That night, they returned to the apartment. It was still silent, but it was no longer suffocating. It was just quiet. Izuku walked to the kitchen table and pulled out the UA high school application forms that Tashinori had left there weeks ago. They had been sitting there, untouched, a symbol of a dream he thought was dead. Now they were a weapon. They were the first step on his new path. He uncapped a pen. His hand was perfectly steady. The weight of his gift, the crushing agony of his power, was still there. It would always be there. But now, it was no longer just a burden to be borne. It was fuel. It was a reason. It was the grim, terrible bedrock upon which he would build his future. He began to fill out the form, his neat, analytical script filling the boxes. Name, Izuku Midoriya. Quirk, telekinesis. He paused at the box asking for the quirk's name. Small object attraction was what was on his mother's registration. It felt inadequate. A lie. He thought for a moment, then wrote down 2 words that felt truer than anything else in the world. Last legacy. He signed his name at the bottom, the pen held firmly in his grasp, a tool not of a student applying to his dream school, but of a soldier enlisting in a war against fate itself. The 10 months had passed in a relentless rhythm of sunrises over a junkyard and sunsets viewed through a film of exhaustion. Dagoba Municipal Beach Park was no longer a landfill. It was a testament. The sand, once hidden beneath mountains of rust and decay, was now a vast, clean expanse that met the ocean in a pristine line. The morning sun glinted off the waves, no longer illuminating heaps of garbage but instead revealing the raw, untamed beauty of the coast. The air smelled only of salt and possibility. Izuku stood at its edge, the UA entrance exam looming just hours away. He was no longer the soft, round-faced boy who had wept on this beach. The grueling training had stripped him bare, carving away his adolescent pudginess and leaving behind a wiry frame of lean muscle, coiled and tense. There was a new stillness about him, a solemnity in his green eyes that seemed a decade too old for his 15-year-old face. Tashinori Yagi stood beside him, looking less like a hero and more like a perpetually worried father. He held out a travel mug of tea. Drink this. You barely touched your breakfast. Izuku took the mug, his fingers brushing against Tashinori's. The man's hand was bony and surprisingly warm. Thanks. Are you ready for this, my boy? Tashinori asked, his gaze sweeping over the clean beach, a monument to Izuku's pain and perseverance. I'm as ready as I can be, Izuku replied, his voice low and steady. It lacked the frantic energy it once had. The muttering had been replaced by a quiet, intense focus. Remember the plan, Tashinori said, falling into the familiar role of a coach. Prioritize control over power. Finesse over force. This is not about showing off, it's about demonstrating competence. You are a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. And most importantly, he paused, his expression softening with a profound, aching concern. You are not to engage in reckless behavior. Your goal is to pass the exam, not to create a spectacle. The objective is to secure your place so you can learn, not to prove a point to anyone. Izuku knew what he was really saying. Don't get anyone hurt. Don't put yourself in a position where you might lose someone else. The unspoken fear hung between them, a constant, silent third party in their relationship. I understand, Izuku said, taking a sip of the tea. It was warm and grounding. No reckless behavior. He looked at the vast, empty beach. He had moved every piece of trash, every rusted car and broken appliance. He had done it all with her legacy. He had turned his grief into a tool, sharpening it to a razor's edge. He wouldn't let that be in vain. The gates of UA High School were even more magnificent and imposing in person. The inverted U of the main building seemed to pierce the sky, a modern glass and steel cathedral dedicated to the religion of heroism. Throngs of teenagers buzzed with nervous energy, their voices a chaotic symphony of excited chatter, boastful proclamations, and whispered anxieties. They were vibrant, loud, and full of life. Izuku moved through them like a ghost. He felt a profound sense of detachment, as if he were separated from them by a wall of smoked glass. They were here chasing a bright, shining dream. He was here to enlist in a grim, personal war. Their quirks were gifts they were excited to show off. His was a scar he was determined to control. He saw Bakugo near the entrance, surrounded by a few wannabe sycophants. Bakugo's eyes scanned the crowd, arrogant and dismissive, until they landed on Izuku. The usual sneer on his face faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion and something else. Irritation, maybe, that Izuku didn't look scared or pathetic. Izuku simply met his gaze, his expression unreadable, before turning and walking into the auditorium. The briefing room was vast, dark, and filled with the low hum of hundreds of whispering examinees. The stage exploded with light and sound as the voice hero, Present Mike, appeared, his signature scream of "Hello everybody!" echoing off the walls. "Welcome to today's live performance. Everybody say hey." Silence. "Tough crowd, huh?" Present Mike carried on undeterred. He launched into an explanation of the practical exam, a 10-minute mock battle in a massive, simulated urban environment. Examinees would use their quirks to disable robotic villains, each worth a different number of points. Izuku listened with an unnerving calm. He wasn't muttering, wasn't fanboying over Present Mike. His mind was a cold, analytical engine, processing the data. 3 types of robots, 1, 2, and 3 points. Difficulty likely scales with point value. The cityscape is the variable. I need to use the environment. My telekinesis is strongest in an area with abundant debris. Open plazas are a kill zone for me, but narrow alleys offer cover and ammunition. And finally, the 4th type of villain. Present Mike boomed, a giant silhouette appearing on the screen behind him. The 0-pointer. This guy is more of a gimmick, an obstacle to be avoided. Think of it like a thwomp from Super Mario. I recommend you run. A tall, broad-shouldered boy with dark blue hair and glasses shot to his feet, his arm chopping the air with rigid precision. Excuse me, sir, a question. Present Mike happily obliged. On the printout, there are clearly 4 types of villains listed. If the 4th is worth 0 points, it is a gross miscalculation on the part of UA. A school of this caliber should not make such a foolish error. The boy then spun around, pointing a rigid finger directly at Izuku. And you, with the messy green hair, you have been sitting there completely silent, looking morose, since the beginning. If you have no intention of taking this seriously, you should leave. You are distracting the rest of us who are committed to the path of heroism. A few nearby students snickered. Izuku slowly lifted his head. He looked at the earnest, passionate boy, later identified as Tenya Ida, and felt a pang of something he couldn't name. It was the ghost of his former self, the enthusiastic muttering fanboy who would have been vibrating with excitement. That boy was dead and buried. Izuku simply stared at Ida, his gaze flat and empty. He didn't offer a defense or an apology. He just looked at him, and the sheer, hollow weight behind his eyes seemed to unnerve the zealous boy. Ida, flustered by the lack of reaction, stammered an apology to the room and sat back down. He's right, Izuku thought, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. I don't belong here with them. The examinees were bussed to their assigned battle centers. Izuku found himself at the gates of Battle Center B, a sprawling, detailed replica of a modern city district. The concrete and steel towers loomed over them, silent and waiting. He stretched his neck, feeling the familiar hum of his power thrumming just beneath his skin, a patient predator waiting to be unleashed. He saw Bakugo standing a few dozen feet away, cracking his knuckles, small pops of explosions already sparking in his palms. He was glaring at Izuku, a look of pure, concentrated fury on his face. He stomped over, his movements aggressive and jerky. Deku, he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. I don't know what kind of cheap trick you pulled to get a quirk, but you've been walking around with that dead look on your face for months. It pisses me off. You think you're better than me now? Izuku turned to face him fully. He was still shorter than Bakugo, but he didn't flinch. He didn't cower. This isn't about you, Kaken, he said, his voice devoid of heat or fear. It was just tired. The calm response seemed to enrage Bakugo more than any argument could have. The hell it isn't. Everything is about me. I'm the one who's going to be number one. You're just a pebble in the road. Whatever pathetic power you have, don't you dare get in my way. Okay, Izuku said. Bakugo froze. He had been expecting a fight, a stammered apology, tears, anything but this flat, dispassionate acceptance. It was like yelling at a statue. It was unnerving. Right, let's start. Present Mick's voice boomed from unseen speakers. Get moving! There are no countdowns in a real fight. The massive gates slid open. While most students hesitated for a beat, confused by the abrupt start, Izuku was already in motion. His training with Tashinori, who often started drills with surprise attacks, had honed his reflexes to a razor's edge. He didn't run. He pulled. He reached out with his mind, grabbed onto a lamppost 100 feet into the city, and yanked himself forward. He shot through the gates like a human slingshot, landing gracefully on his feet as the rest of the examinees were just starting their sprint. He was alone in the concrete canyon. It was silent for a moment, and then the world erupted in the grinding screech of metal. A one-point robot rolled around a corner, its single red optical sensor locking onto him. Target acquired, it buzzed. Izuku didn't even break stride. He flicked his wrist. A manhole cover ripped out of the street and flew through the air like a discus, embedding itself in the robot's torso with a sickening crunch of wires and steel. The robot sparked, spasmed, and fell silent. 1 point. He plunged deeper into the city. His senses were alive, his mind a whirlwind of tactical calculations. He could feel the city around him, the weight of the concrete, the lines of rebar within the walls, the loose debris on the streets. It was his armory. Two-pointers cornered a girl with pink hair who was desperately trying to melt their armor with acid. They were closing in on her. Izuku, from half a block away, reached out and tore a chunk of pavement from the ground beneath their treads. The robots tilted and crashed into each other, tangled and helpless. The girl looked around, stunned, before quickly dispatching them. Izuku didn't wait for thanks. He was already moving. He saw a three-pointer, a larger, bipedal machine, bearing down on a boy who was shooting lasers from his navel. The boy was clearly overwhelmed. Scalpel, not sledgehammer, Tashinori's voice echoed in his head. Izuku ducked behind a parked car. He focused, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't try to crush the massive robot. He targeted its joints. With a sharp mental twist, he seized the bolts in the robot's right knee actuator and wrenched them free. The bolts shot out like bullets, clattering against a nearby wall. The robot's leg buckled, and the 3-ton machine crashed to the ground, immobilized. 3 points. He became a whirlwind of efficient, silent destruction. He wasn't like Bakugo, who was blasting his way through the city in a blaze of glory and collateral damage. Izuku was a ghost, a puppeteer of the urban environment. He ripped fire hydrants from their moorings and used the high-pressure streams to short-circuit robots. He tore down street signs and used them as giant, cleaving blades. He collapsed a weak section of a wall to crush a group of one-pointers. His movements were precise, economical, and utterly devoid of joy. Every use of his power was a whisper of his mother's name, a fresh twist of the knife in his heart. The katsudon she made, the way she'd pull a misplaced sock toward her from across the room. The power was a constant, agonizing reminder. So he used it with a grim, solemn purpose, letting the pain fuel his focus. He wasn't just racking up villain points. His primary directive, burned into his soul by his new motivation, was to protect. He saw a boy with electrified hair about to be blindsided by a 2-pointer. Izuku yanked a nearby dumpster into the robot's path, giving the boy time to react. He spotted another examinee trapped under a piece of falling debris from another's out-of-control quirk and levitated it away. For every robot he disabled, he performed 2 acts of quiet intervention, earning rescue points he wasn't even aware existed. He lost track of time, entering a state of pure flow, of action and reaction. He was a perfect machine of battlefield control. Then the ground began to tremble. A low, deep groan shook the entire battle center. Buildings vibrated, their windows rattling. Dust rained down from the tops of the skyscrapers. From behind a block of buildings, a shadow fell over the street, vast and absolute. The 0-pointer. It was colossal. A moving skyscraper of dark green metal, its head scraping the tops of the 10-story buildings. Its massive treads crushed cars and pavement into dust as it rolled forward, a single, baleful red eye scanning the area. It was less a robot and more a force of nature. President Mick's advice was simple: run. And everyone did. A wave of terrified teenagers fled in the opposite direction, their faces pale with shock. This wasn't a test, it was a monster. Izuku turned to join them, his own heart pounding. His power was useless against something that massive. He couldn't lift it. He couldn't crush it. It was beyond his scale. Oof! He heard a small cry of pain. He stopped, his head snapping back toward the approaching behemoth. A girl with a brown bob and pink circles on her cheeks was trapped. She had tripped, and her leg was pinned beneath a large slab of concrete, likely shaken loose by the robot's approach. It was the friendly girl he had seen at the gates, the one who had stopped him from tripping on his way in. The zero-pointer's shadow fell over her. Its massive tread was less than 50 yards away, grinding inexorably forward. She was going to be crushed. The other students were gone. The heroes were just observers. No one was coming to help her. In that instant, the world narrowed to 2 points, the terrified girl and the unstoppable machine. And in his mind, he saw a different collapsing structure. He saw a different person trapped. He saw his mother's face. No. The word was a silent scream in his soul. Not again. I will not let it happen again. Tashinori's warnings, the plan, the promise of no recklessness, it all evaporated in the white-hot furnace of his resolve. He spun on his heel and charged toward the zero-pointer. He didn't have a plan. He was running on pure, terrified instinct. As he ran, his analytical mind, honed by months of training and a lifetime of observation, kicked into overdrive, frantically searching for a solution. Too big to lift. Too thick to crush. It's not a single object, it's a machine. Machines have parts. Parts can be broken. His eyes scanned the metallic titan, looking for a weakness, a seam, anything. He saw it. The outer chassis wasn't a single, solid piece. It was comprised of massive armor plates, each one bolted onto a structural frame. The bolts were thick as his arm, but they were a weak point. A point of entry. He reached the girl. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice strained. "My leg. I'm stuck," she cried, her brown eyes wide with terror. "Hold on." He didn't try to lift the slab of concrete. It would take too long. Instead, he turned his full attention to the approaching robot. The air around him grew heavy, charged with power. The dust on the ground began to stir, rising in small cyclones around his feet. He let out a yell, a sound of pure, concentrated effort, and pulled. Scree! The sound was a horrific shriek of tortured metal. A massive armor plate, the size of a city bus, tore free from the zero-pointer's torso. Dozens of huge bolts popped from their sockets like champagne corks, ricocheting off nearby buildings. The plate, weighing countless tons, hovered in the air, held aloft by the sheer, desperate force of Izuku's will. The effort was immense. Blood began to trickle from his nose. His muscles screamed in protest. But he held it. The zero-pointer, its internal wiring now exposed, continued to roll forward, oblivious. It didn't have time to stop. Izuku didn't throw the plate at the robot. That was brute force. He was a scalpel. With another grunt of effort, he maneuvered the massive sheet of metal and the slab pinning the girl's leg. He wasn't just moving two objects, he was creating a structure. He formed a protective cocoon, a makeshift fortress of concrete and steel, around her. The zero-pointer's massive tread rolled right over them. For a moment, there was only darkness and the deafening, grinding roar of the machine passing overhead. The girl screamed. Izuku, inside the protective bubble with her, gritted his teeth, his arms trembling as he held the tons of metal and concrete in place, his power the only thing between them and oblivion. Then light. The robot had passed. It continued its slow, destructive journey down the street. Izuku released his hold. The armor plate and the concrete slab crashed to the ground with a deafening boom, kicking up a huge cloud of dust. The strain vanished, and Izuku collapsed to his knees, panting, his vision swimming with black spots. The metallic tang of blood filled his mouth. "Are you okay?" he managed to choke out. The girl, Achiko Uraraka, scrambled free, her legs scraped but not broken. She looked from the departing monster to the exhausted, bleeding boy on his knees. She had seen it all. She had seen him charge a monster to save a stranger. She had seen him command a storm of metal with a look of pained, desperate determination on his face. You saved me," she breathed, her voice full of awe. Before Izuku could respond, a deafening buzzer echoed through the city. "Time's up." It was over. In a darkened monitoring room deep within UA's main building, a bank of screens showed every angle of the exam. A small, strange assortment of pro-heroes watched the results tally up. "That Bakugo kid is a real powerhouse," President Mike exclaimed, pointing at a screen. 77 villain points. "A new record. He's powerful, but his methods are destructive and his attitude leaves much to be desired," a tired voice drawled. Shota Aizawa, Eraserhead, was slumped in his chair, his eyes bloodshot. "He shows no regard for his surroundings or the potential for civilian casualties. A high-risk, high-reward type. A headache." "Oh, lighten up, Shota," said the R-rated hero, Midnight. "He's got fighting spirit. That's what UA is all about." The principal, a small, white-furred creature in a sharp suit, merely smiled. "Indeed," Misa said, sipping his tea. "But the highest villain point score does not always make the best hero." He tapped a button on his console, and the main screen changed, replaying the final moments from Battle Center B. The room fell silent as they watched the tiny green-haired boy charge the zero-pointer. They saw him rip the armor plate free with a shriek of metal. They saw him construct the protective shield. "My word," said the hero Cementas. "The sheer power of that telekinesis is astounding. To lift an object of that size and density." "It's not the power that's interesting," Aizawa said, leaning forward for the first time, his sharp eyes narrowed in intense focus. "It's the application. He didn't attack it. He didn't try to stop it. He disassembled it and used the parts for defense. That's not the thinking of a reckless teenager. That's the tactical thinking of a veteran pro." "And look at this," Nisa said, his black eyes gleaming with intellectual curiosity. He brought up a final scoreboard. Katsuki Bakugo was at the top with 77 villain points and 0 rescue points. Many others had a mix. And there, in second place, was Izuku Midoriya. Villain points, 45. Rescue points, 60. Total, 105. 60 rescue points, President Mike whistled. "That's also a new record. The kid was saving people left and right." "He was," Aizawa confirmed, rewatching footage of Izuku's precise, non-lethal takedowns and constant, subtle interventions. He fought the entire exam with a self-imposed directive to prevent harm. Every move was calculated for maximum efficiency and minimum collateral damage. Aizawa zoomed in on Izuku's face just after he saved Uraraka. The boy wasn't triumphant. He wasn't excited. He looked haunted. But there's something else. There's a profound sadness in him. A weight. His precision isn't just tactical, it feels somber. Like he's performing a grim duty. Nisa took another sip of his tea, a thoughtful, almost predatory smile on his face. Accursed potential, perhaps? A boy with the power of a god and the heart of a martyr. What a fascinating conundrum. He's not just a potential hero. He's a potential masterpiece of psychological study. He turned to Aizawa. "I trust you'll find him a stimulating addition to your class, Shota." Aizawa grunted, but a flicker of genuine interest showed in his tired eyes. He preferred students who were quiet, practical, and understood the grim reality of hero work. This kid, whoever he was, seemed to understand it better than most. A week later, the letter from Yue arrived. Izuku held the thick envelope in his hands, his fingers tracing the prestigious seal. The apartment was quiet, as always. Tashinori stood in the doorway of the kitchen, trying and failing to look casual. "Well?" he asked, his voice tight. "Aren't you going to open it?" Izuku nodded, his throat dry. He walked to the kitchen table, the table where he'd had his last breakfast with his mom, and sat down. He carefully opened the envelope. A small metal disc fell out onto the table. It whirred to life, and a hologram flickered into existence. It wasn't All Might. It was Principal Nizu. "Greetings, Mr. Midoriya." The chipper voice of the principal began. I am here to inform you of your results. You passed the written portion with flying colors, of course, but your performance in the practical exam was, to put it mildly, exemplary. The hologram showed a replay of his fight, highlighting his 45 villain points. A fine score. But that's not the whole story. The screen switched to show his various rescues, culminating in the zero-pointer incident. We at UE do not believe that heroism is merely about defeating villains. It is about saving others. That is why the exam has a hidden component, rescue points, awarded for acts of altruism and self-sacrifice. The hologram showed his final score, 105. Izuku Midoriya, Nisa declared with a smile. Your desire to protect others, even at great personal risk, embodies the very spirit of this institution. Come, young Midoriya. This is your hero academia. The hologram flickered out, leaving the disc spinning silently on the table. Izuku stared at it. He had done it. He was in. The first, most difficult step of his mission was complete. A faint, unfamiliar feeling flickered in his chest. It took him a moment to identify it. It was pride, a small, fragile flame in the vast, cold darkness of his grief. Taishinori let out a huge sigh of relief, his skinny frame slumping. You did it, my boy. You really did it. He came over and put a hand on Izuku's shoulder, but the flicker of pride was already being extinguished, overshadowed by the familiar, crushing weight. He looked down at his hands, the conduits of his mother's legacy. He had used her power to get here. He had used his pain as a weapon. This acceptance wasn't a prize. It was a confirmation of his duty. It was a heavier link in the chain he had chosen to bear. He was going to UA. Not to chase a dream, but to stand guard against a nightmare. He would walk its hallowed halls, learn from the best, and hone his inherited power until it was a perfect, impenetrable shield. He would make friends, and he would keep them at arm's length, loving them from a distance so that his curse could never touch them. His journey was just beginning, and he already felt the exhaustion of 1,000 battles yet to be fought. The first few weeks at UA High were a study in controlled isolation. Izuku existed as an island in the bustling archipelago of Class 1A. He was polite, he was present, but he was not truly there. He sat in class, his notebooks filled not with doodles, but with precise, almost clinical notes on his classmates' quirks. He analyzed Kirishima's hardening limits, Yaoyorozu's creation versatility, Todoroki's simmering dual nature. It was the same process he'd always used, but the childish joy was gone, replaced by the grim pragmatism of a field marshal studying his own troops, cataloging their strengths and weaknesses for a war only he knew he was fighting. His homeroom teacher, Shota Aizawa, was a man Izuku came to respect almost immediately. On the first day, Aizawa had subjected them to a grueling quirk apprehension test, threatening the last-place student with expulsion. The class had been a mess of panic and frantic effort. Izuku, however, saw the logic in the man's exhaustion-laced threats. He saw the rational deception for what it was, a tool to push them past their perceived limits. When it was his turn for the ball throw, he stepped into the circle and felt the familiar, heavy weight of his power settle in his bones. He didn't try to emulate All Might's explosive force. He simply held the ball, closed his eyes for a second, and pushed. The ball shot from his hand with a silent, invisible shove, soaring through the air and landing with a distant puff of dust. The result was an impressive 708.2 meters. Aizawa had simply grunted, his tired eyes lingering on Izuku for a beat longer than the others. He saw no triumph in Izuku's expression, only the quiet completion of a task. This boy wasn't trying to show off, he was demonstrating capability. It was during lunch that his carefully constructed walls began to show cracks. He would sit alone, poring over his notes, until a bright, cheerful voice broke through his concentration. Mind if we sit here? Achiko Uraraka, the girl he'd saved in the entrance exam, stood there with a tray, her round face alight with a genuine smile. Beside her was the tall, rigid boy who had admonished him during the briefing, Tenya Ida. Izuku blinked, startled. Oh. Sure. It's fine. I never got to thank you properly for what you did at the exam, Uraraka said, setting her tray down with a clatter. That was amazing. You were so cool. Indeed, Ida added, sitting with perfect posture. While your initial morose behavior was unbecoming of a UA applicant, your actions demonstrated a supreme and noble heroic spirit. I must apologize for my presumptuous accusation. You saw the true nature of the test while I did not. He finished with a deep, formal bow from a seated position. Izuku felt a flush of heat creep up his neck. It was nothing. I just did what anyone would have done. I don't think so, a quiet, calm voice added. He looked up to see a girl with long, dark green hair and a wide, frog-like mouth standing beside their table. It was Tsuyu Azuri. She had a way of observing everything with her large, placid eyes. May I join you? Karo, she asked, her verbal tick a soft, croaking sound. Of course. Uraraka chirped. Azuri sat, her movements unhurried. I was watching you during the quirk test, Midoriya-chan, she said, her gaze direct and unnervingly perceptive. Your quirk is very powerful. It reminds me a little of All Might's raw strength, but it's quiet. And when you use it, you look sad. The table fell silent. Ida and Uraraka looked uncomfortable, as if Azuri had crossed an unspoken line. But Izuku didn't feel offended. He felt seen. Her blunt observation wasn't malicious. It was just a fact, stated as plainly as if she were commenting on the weather. It's complicated, Izuku mumbled, looking down at his hands. Most things are, she replied simply, taking a bite of her jelly bread. From that day on, they became a small, tentative group. Ida's rigid earnestness, Uraraka's bubbly warmth, and Azuri's calm, steady presence formed a gentle tide that lapped at the shores of his isolation. He still kept his distance, a part of him terrified of what getting too close might mean, but he found himself drawn to their company. He connected with Ida over their shared analytical approach to heroics, though Ida's was by the book, while his was forged in trauma. He was warmed by Uraraka's unflagging kindness, a trait that reminded him so painfully of his mother. But it was Tsuyu, or Tsu, as she insisted they call her, with whom he formed the most unexpected bond. They were both watchers. One afternoon, they sat together on a bench, observing Bakugo and Todoroki during a training exercise. Bakugo-chan is always so angry, Tsu noted, her head tilted. It makes his quirk stronger, but it also makes him predictable. He always leads with his right. Izuku, who had filled 3 pages with diagrams of Bakugo's explosive trajectories, looked at her in surprise. I noticed that too. His reliance on overwhelming force leaves him open to counters if you can weather the initial blast. And Todoroki-chan, she continued, her gaze shifting. He's strong. Maybe the strongest of all of us. But he seems so unhappy. He only ever uses half of himself. It's like he's fighting his own power. Izuku fell silent. She didn't just analyze quirks, she analyzed the people who wielded them. She saw the emotional core, the thing he was so desperately trying to ignore in himself. You notice a lot, ASU, Tsu-chan, he said quietly. I like to watch people, she replied, her wide mouth curving into a small smile. It helps me understand them. That's part of being a hero, I think. Knowing how to support your friends. She looked at him, her dark eyes clear and honest. I'm not as flashy as some of the others, Karo. But I want to be a hero who my friends can always rely on. The steady one who has their backs. Her words were a spear of ice in his chest. The one who has their backs. It was a sentiment so pure, so heroic, it felt like it belonged to a different world than the one he now inhabited. For a fleeting, dangerous moment, he felt the desire to tell her everything. To unburden himself of the crushing weight of his quirk. But the fear, cold and absolute, held him back. To tell them the truth would be to mark them. It was better to be a quiet, sad island than a beacon for the Reaper. The day of the trip to the unforeseen simulation joint, or USJ, dawned bright and clear. The mood on the bus was light, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Izuku's soul. Hey, Midoriya! Denki Kaminari called out from a few seats ahead. Your quirk is insane. It's like Super ESP, right? But you never look happy when you use it. What's the deal, man? You got some kinda amokinesis? A few students laughed. Izuku just stared out the window, his reflection a pale, solemn mask. That's not a very heroic line of questioning, Kaminari-kun. Ida chopped the air, ever the class representative. One's quirk is a personal matter. Still, Kirishima added, leaning over the seat with a sharp-toothed grin. He's got a point. You took out that giant robot without even touching it. It was super manly, but also kinda spooky, like something out of a horror movie. I think it's wonderful, Uraraka chimed in, defending him. It means Deku-kun can save people from a distance, without getting hurt. The name Deku, once a brand of shame, had been recontextualized by Uraraka into something positive. Izuku knew he should feel grateful, but it still felt like a lie. He was anything but capable of saving people without someone getting hurt. Tsu, sitting beside him, tapped his arm gently. I think your quirk is strong because you are Midoriya-chan. You're quiet, but you think more than anyone else here. He gave her a small, grateful nod, but said nothing. Her kindness was a danger he couldn't afford. The USJ was a massive dome, a self-contained ecosystem of disaster simulations. They were met by the space hero, 13, whose speech about the duality of quirks sent a fresh wave of ice through Izuku's veins. I am certain you all possess quirks you think are amazing, 13 announced, their voice filtered through their helmet. But you must never forget that there are many quirks that can kill with a single mistake. My own quirk, Black Hole, could easily be used to murder. It is a power designed to save people from disasters, but it is also a power that can turn people to dust. In our superhuman society, all it takes is one wrong move, one flicker of ill intent, and your power can become a weapon of pure destruction. Izuku's hands clenched into fists. He knew. Oh God, he knew. His quirk wasn't designed to kill, but it was born from death. It was a monument built on a grave, and he lived in constant terror of laying a new foundation stone. Aizawa stepped forward. All right, that's enough. Let's get started. But they never did. The lights flickered and died. The central fountain sputtered. And in the plaza below, the air itself seemed to ripple and tear open, a swirling vortex of black and purple mist vomiting forth a tide of grotesque figures. From the center of the portal stepped a man covered in dismembered hands, his pale hair a chaotic mess, his posture a twitchy, unsettling crawl. Stay back! Aizawa yelled, his capture weapon unfurling around his neck as he slapped his yellow goggles over his eyes. Those are real villains, the students gasped, a collective intake of terrified breath. This wasn't a simulation. 13. Protect the students, Aizawa commanded before leaping down the massive staircase, a lone hero charging into a sea of enemies. Kurojiri, you were supposed to deal with 13. And where is he? I went to all the trouble of bringing so many of my friends from the party. The man-child, Shigaraki, rasped, scratching his neck with a frantic energy. Aizawa was a whirlwind of controlled violence. He moved with a dancer's grace and a predator's efficiency, erasing quirks and using his capture weapon to bind and disable villains with breathtaking speed. You can't be a hero with just one trick, he muttered to himself, a lesson Izuku took to heart. But as he fought the purple mist, the villain named Kurojiri manifested before the students. I'm sorry, but our purpose today is to meet the symbol of peace, and if he is not here, we shall simply have to scatter you and kill you. Before anyone could react, the mist enveloped them. Izuku felt a disorienting lurch, the world dissolving into a purple blur. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, the ceiling of the USJ was a distant sight. He was falling, plummeting toward the churning water of the shipwreck zone. He hit the water with a gasp, the cold a brutal shock. When he surfaced, he wasn't alone. Mineta, the small, purple-haired boy, was flailing and screaming, and a few feet away, Tsu's head broke the surface, her expression as calm as ever. Kero. Looks like we're in trouble, she said. The water around them began to fill with villains, their menacing grins reflecting in the murky water. Izuku's mind, sharpened by a year of crisis-driven training, went into overdrive. They don't know our quirks, he said, his voice low and urgent. They scattered us, assuming we'd be easy prey. That's their mistake. They put you, Tsu-chan, a frog quirk user, in a water environment. And what about you and Mineta-chan? She asked. They don't know about me, Izuku said, a grim look on his face. He looked at the villains closing in. And they're about to find out. He dove beneath the surface, his eyes wide open. He reached out with his mind, not at a single object, but at the water itself. It was an audacious, desperate move, something he'd never tried before. But water was an object, wasn't it? Just a vast, fluid one. He felt the connection, a thrumming, immense power that dwarfed anything he had ever felt on the beach. He let out a silent scream, pouring his will into the lake. On the surface, the water began to churn. It swirled, picking up speed, forming a massive, violent whirlpool that sucked the stunned villains toward its center, slamming them together with crushing force. "Now, Tsu-chan!" he yelled, surfacing. Tsu acted instantly. She wrapped her long, powerful tongue around Izuku and Mineta and, with a mighty leap, cleared the whirlpool and landed them safely on the deck of the central ship. Izuku collapsed, his nose bleeding freely from the immense strain of controlling so much mass. "That was amazing, Midoriya-chan," Tsu said, her eyes wide with genuine admiration. "You saved us. We need to get to Mr. Aizawa," Izuku gasped, wiping the blood from his lip. "He can't fight them all alone." They made their way to the edge of the ship, their vantage point giving them a clear, horrifying view of the central plaza. Aizawa was still fighting, but he was slowing down. His movements were becoming sluggish, his quirk erasures shorter, as his dry eyes forced him to blink. And then the monster appeared. A hulking, bird-beaked creature with an exposed brain, its muscles bulging grotesquely. It moved with a speed that defied its size, appearing behind Aizawa in an instant. The fight was brutally short. The creature, the Nomu, caught Aizawa, smashing his face into the pavement, and breaking his arms with a series of sickening, wet crunches. Izuku felt a wave of nausea. Aizawa, their teacher, a powerful pro-hero, was being dismantled like a toy. Shigaraki cackled, a dry, rasping sound. "He's so cool, my Nomu. He's an anti-symbol of peace, designed specifically to kill All Might." They had to do something. All Might wasn't here. No one was coming. It was up to them. "We have to help him," Izuku said, his voice a strained whisper. "Are you crazy?" Mineta squeaked, his body trembling. "That thing will kill us." "He's right," Tsu said, her own voice tight with fear for the first time. "But, we can't just leave him." Kero. Izuku's mind raced, searching for a plan, any plan. But there was no debris to use, no angle of attack. Just a monster and their broken teacher. Then Shigaraki saw them. His red eyes, visible through the gaps in the hand on his face, locked onto their small group. "Oh? More party guests? Noma. Kill the one with the green hair. He looks like he might be annoying." The Noma let out a guttural shriek and blurred into motion. It wasn't running, it was a projectile of pure muscle, crossing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. Izuku froze. For one fatal, horrifying second, his mind went blank. The sheer speed, the absolute certainty of death, it was paralyzing. He saw the massive fist swing towards him, a sledgehammer descending to crush him into paste. He was too slow. His power was too slow. This was it. He closed his eyes. He didn't feel the impact. He felt a sudden, powerful yank. A sticky, green rope had wrapped around his waist, pulling him backward with incredible force. He stumbled, falling to the ground as a dark shape flew past where he had been standing. He looked up, his heart a block of ice in his chest. Tsuyu Ajiri stood between him and the Noma. Her tongue was still extended, its tip now lying limp on the ground near him. She had used her signature move not to attack, but to save him. She had pulled him out of the path of death and put herself in his place. Her wide, dark eyes were fixed on him. They held no regret, no fear. Only a calm, sad finality. A silent fulfillment of her promise. "I'll always have my friends' backs." The Noma's fist, which had been aimed at Izuku's head, connected with her small torso. The sound was not loud. It was a sickening, wet thump, followed by a sharp crack that seemed to echo in a world that had suddenly gone utterly silent. Her body was thrown backward, tumbling like a discarded doll before landing in a crumpled heap 20 feet away. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She was just still, silence, the same profound, soul-shattering silence from the day the overpass fell. The world once again faded to a muted gray. The sounds of battle, Mineta's terrified whimper, Shigaraki's breathing, it all disappeared. There was only the image of Tsu's still form, and the gaping, cavernous hole that had just been torn open in Izuku's soul. No. The thought was a whimper. No. Not again. Please, not again. It was his fault. He had let her get close. He had let her be his friend. And now she was dead. His curse had claimed another victim. The grief was a physical force, a white-hot agony that consumed him. It was sharper than the grief for his mother, more shocking, more immediate. This wasn't an accident he had inadvertently caused. This was a sacrifice made for him. The weight of it was unbearable. And then, just like before, something inside him shattered. The void left by his grief was flooded with a new, alien energy. It was different from the first legacy. His mother's power felt warm, a familiar presence. This new power was cold. It felt amphibious, slick, and unnervingly flexible. It was the echo of a life just extinguished. A coldness spread over his skin, making it feel tacky, adhesive. The muscles in his legs coiled with a new, spring-loaded power, and from his back, just below his shoulder blades, a shimmering, translucent green appendage of pure energy unfurled. It was long, prehensile, and looked horrifyingly like a ghostly version of Tsu's tongue. The world rushed back in, the sounds crashing down on him. Well, that was unexpected, Shigaraki rasped, scratching his neck. She jumped in the way. How pointlessly heroic. What was that just now? A light show? He gestured at Izuku. Nomu, finish the job. The Nomu turned, its beady eyes fixing on Izuku once more. But Izuku was no longer frozen. He was a creature of pure, grieving instinct. He was a walking tomb, and the ghost of his friend was now a weapon he wielded. He didn't think. He reacted. As the Nomu charged, Izuku crouched, the new power in his legs propelling him into a massive, twisting leap that sent him soaring over the monster's head. He landed silently on the vertical face of a nearby rock formation, his hands and feet sticking to the surface with an unnatural grip. Shigaraki stared, his scratching stopping for a second. What the? From his new perch, Izuku saw Aizawa's broken form lying perilously close to the villain's. He had to get him. He had to save someone. The energy whip lashed out from his back. It was faster and stronger than Tsu's tongue had ever been. It wrapped around Aizawa's torso with impossible gentleness, and with a powerful tug, Izuku pulled his teacher's unconscious body up and away from the villains, securing him to the wall beside him. He now clung to the wall, a gargoyle of grief, holding his broken teacher, the legacy of his dead friend shimmering behind him. He looked down at Shigaraki, and for the first time, his eyes held something other than sadness or fear. They held a cold, bottomless rage. Mineta was sobbing on the ground. Shigaraki was staring up, a look of intrigued confusion on his face. The Nomu shrieked in frustration. The tableau was one of chaos and despair. Boom! The entrance doors to the USJ were blasted off their hinges, sent flying inward as if hit by a cannonball. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, vast and powerful. The smoke cleared to reveal the towering form of All Might. But he was not smiling. His face was a mask of thunderous fury, his blue eyes blazing as they took in the scene before him, the horde of villains, the injured Aizawa, the terrified Mineta, and his student, his ward, Izuku Midoriya, clinging to a wall like a spider, cradling his dying teacher, radiating a new and terrifying power that All Might had never seen before. All Might's gaze fell on the small, still form of Tsuyu Ajiri lying on the ground, and the symbol of peace understood that he had arrived far, far too late.